The ruthless life of a Japanese shogun. In medieval Japan, military dictators were known as shoguns and were given blessing by the emperor to create order. They were the highest ranking position in the noble military class in the ancient times of feudal Japan. A shogun may have been ranked as less than royal, but he was seen as powerful and even the leader of Japan. What exactly is a shogun? Shogun translates to troops general, but this term tends to diminish how important they truly were. They were government rulers that took over Japan and had huge armies backing them up. Other parts of the government were developed in this time to keep order through the shogunate reign, which spanned over hundreds of years. There was some trading, the developing of arts, economic development, and more that came as a benefit during the rule of the shoguns. However, there were some pretty nasty situations where Christians were banned or beheaded in the 1600s as well. Keep in mind here that any medieval civilization was somewhat barbaric, so the ones who kept order would have to be somewhat ruthless themselves. Let's dig in and find out more about the lives of the Japanese shogun as we explain their lives and importance. Shogun rule of Japan. The shogun ruled for 7 centuries until the Meiji Restoration of 1868 CE. They were held by members of specific families that gave their names to successive shogunate governments. There was the Ashikaga shogunate from 1338 to 1573 CE and the Tokugawa shogunate from 1603 to 1868 CE. The first shoguns, the capital was represented, which was the Kamakura shogunate. There were other shogunates as well that would be called based on their capital city or region. For example, the Tokugawa shogunate was the original name of Tokyo. It was the Tokugawa shoguns that were probably the most ruthless. They got this name because of their brutal beheading of Christians as recently as the 1600s. Minamoto no Yoritomo and the Kamakura shogunate. In 1192 CE, Minamoto no Yoritomo was the first proper shogun. In more modern times, one would call him a military dictator. The emperor was about the shogun, but really it was the shogun that controlled the army. They were there to offer an alternative system from the Japanese imperial court, which wasn't working at the time. It was the emperor who allowed Yoritomo to hold his shogun title in return for military protection. He was a legend and is still seen today as one of the most famous samurai fighters in Japan's history. He led many battles, taking over clans to help his half-brother consolidate power. It was he who introduced the shogunate government system, which was meant to keep peace and order in Japan after many years of troubles. Bakufu was a term used within the shogun rule, which meant tent office. This is because their original temporary headquarters were set up on a battlefield. Yoritomo was succeeded by his oldest son after a power struggle, and when Yoritomo died, his wife and her father ruled themselves. They created the position of shiken and promoted the interests of their Hojo clan. It was the regent that had the real power, while the shogun was considered a puppet, and each one was chosen by the Hojo. A shogun would have to come from a warrior class to become powerful in ways that would usually not be available to them. There were 9 shoguns in the original Kamakura period, and these shoguns were considered the most powerful. Ashikaga shoguns. While the Kamakura shoguns were the strongest, they had regents who ruled them to fit whatever purpose they had in mind. The shoguns themselves were not ruling Japan, but the shogunate government. This only changed when the Ashikaga shogunate was established and shoguns became the true leaders once again. The next set of shoguns started with Ashikaga Takauji, who became the shogun in 1338. In total, there were 15 Ashikaga shoguns, which were always much weaker than the original shoguns. This was mainly because they didn't have very many territories, so they had to rely on daimyos, which translates to warlords having large areas of land. The power that a shogun had was connected to how many daimyos they were in partnership with. For this reason, daimyos became much more powerful than the Ashikaga shoguns, and they were defeated. The last shogun was Ashikaga Yoshiaki. Shogunate Government. The Shogunate government was on top of social and political society. They gave land to loyal followers for military service. This was both personal and of the individual samurai armies. The shogun had support from different ministers, institutions, and official parties. They were added to the government apparatus as time went on and things got more politically complex. In 1180 CE, the Samurai Dokor Board of Retainers came together. They were supervised vassal warriors known as kogenin. Their prime mission was to execute discipline for misdemeanors. The kogenin also supervised government agents in provinces, the shogun's personal property, and the security of Heiankyo. The imperial court of the capital was supervised by Kyoto Shugo. There were also special commissions in areas that were much further from the government headquarters. The deputy shogun is an example of this. Known as kenrei, they hold a position based on a rotation between three distinct families, the Shiba, Hoshikawa, and Hatakeyama. The kenrei was a new role created in 1333 CE as a way to liaison between the shogun and regional military governors. Patron of the arts. While it may seem that shoguns only fought to gain land, they also created art and buildings. The government would change based on their choice of city, and when Kamakura was in charge, they were in the Muromachi of Heiankyo. The Tokugawa shogunate was based in Edo. These moves would make big changes and consequences sometimes. Shoguns would always look to make their capital more beautiful, which could include elaborate castles and temples. Schools would be built as well. They would often become patrons of fine arts and commission artists to create paintings and sculptures. They would sponsor theatre performances and deeply honored the Japanese tea ceremony, making it an elegant aristocratic affair that many would look forward to. One of the famous buildings developed was the Temple of the Golden Pavilion in 1397 CE. In Kyoto, many stunning palaces were built, including the serene Temple of the Silver Pavilion and the Nijo Castle. The shoguns would also restore buildings, spending money on temple sites. The Fall of Shogunism. The reason shoguns took over in the first place was because the emperor's power was weakening. This allowed the shoguns to easily gain control. They had ultimate control over warrior armies, including the samurai. Throughout their history of reign, there were some who would challenge the shoguns. This included the coup by Emperor Go-Toba in 1221 CE, which was known as the Jokyu disturbance. This ended badly for the emperor as he was exiled. Another failed attempt included the imperial challenge known as Kenmu Restoration, led by Emperor Go-Daigo. This merely replaced one shogunate with another. Threats from other countries were also a problem for the shoguns. The Mongol leader Kublai Khan wanted to invade Japan a few times, but mighty typhoon storms stopped them in their tracks. It was almost as if some otherworldly entity intervened time and time again. The Onin War was a civil war between rival warlords that brought death and destruction to Japan. Bitter unrest during the Sengoku period was seen in the 1400s as well. The turmoil ended after 99 years with the rise of a warlord known as Oda Nobunaga. He expanded his territory and defeated all those who tried to confront him. He seized Heiankyo in 1568 and exiled the last shogun of the Ashikaga shogun. So it was in 1573 that the shogun period finally ended. Powerful warlords after this sidelined the shogunates to the back seat of Japanese politics. These warlords were considered great unifiers of Japan. They forged the single state into the modern era and ruled until 1868 CE. In the end, shoguns were unable to defeat threatening powers that came from Great Britain and the United States. The Meiji Restoration completely abolished any position the shogun had in government. Finally, after hundreds of years, full power was given back to the emperors of Japan. What made the shoguns so ruthless? While it may seem like we've described a fairly civilized way of living while under shogunate rule, in fact, there were plenty of cons. There was a strict social hierarchy, so one could never become more than what they were born into. The class structure was limited, and there were few opportunities for those who didn't have proper class standings. There were also heavy taxes on people, which led to economic hardship. The beautiful buildings they created weren't going to pay for themselves, so while the common people starved, shoguns built lavish buildings to demonstrate their power. International trade and cultural exchange were extremely limited. You might compare it to the likes of North Korea today. There was a strict enforcement of social order. This led to the suppression of freedom and creativity among common people. Women had no sense of power unless they happened to be powerful by name. Regardless of this, they were never better than the powerful man that they married. Thank you for watching today's video. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to this channel to get more amazing content.